Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world. Each week, I sit down with leading journalists and experts to break down what's happening in the world, why it matters, and what comes next. Today, it is Friday, February 27, and a lot of news this week. We'll start with Ukraine, which 3 days ago entered its 5th year of full-scale war and its 13th year of war against Russia. It's been an extraordinarily costly conflict, not least for the aggressor. Russia is losing at the moment some 30,000 soldiers every month, and it has lost close to 1.5 million people, deaths and severe casualties in just the past 4 years. Ukraine, of course, too, has suffered, with more civilians killed in the last year than in any previous year of the war. And while talks continued, pushed by the United States, there doesn't seem a lot of progress in those talks or much of a prospect for an agreement. So we'll take stock where we are, where we think the war is going ahead, and what we can expect for this year. And then we'll turn to President Trump's biggest defeat of his presidency. Last Friday, the Supreme Court ruled he couldn't impose tariffs just because he wanted to. He had to demonstrate that there was actually a legal basis for doing so, and the legal basis he had appealed to was not really legal. The Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision. Of course, Trump responded by using other legal authorities to raise tariffs temporarily, but, and this is important, his ability to threaten and then impose tariffs to achieve whatever goal he wants, whether it is to change the Supreme Court of Brazil's mind, to get India to stop importing Russian oil, or whatever other reason he has used to impose tariffs, that is no longer possible. So what does this all mean for the global economy? How have our other trading partners reacted, and what can we expect next? And then finally, Cuba. In a weird, almost 1960s kind of incident earlier this week, 10 Cubans traveled on a stolen speedboat from the Florida Keys to try and infiltrate the island that is 90 miles offshore. 4 dead and 6 wounded later. Questions persist whether this was a rogue operation, a U.S.-inspired operation, or, in fact, a Cuban false flag. What is clear, however, is that Cuba is going through a very, very difficult time as the U.S. has cut off oil shipments to the island. The goal is to change Cuba's internal behavior, if not its regime. So will Trump be any more successful than any of his 11 predecessors who've been trying to get rid of the communist dictatorship just off Florida's coast? We'll talk about that. We'll talk, in fact, about all these questions with 3 reporters who cover these stories. Felicia Schwartz is a diplomatic correspondent at Politico and formerly reported for the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times in various parts in the world, including from the Middle East. Hey, Felicia, great to see you. How are you faring in the nation's capital today?
Just so many wars, so little time.
Well, at least the good news is there's so much to write about. So that's what a journalist's dream, right? Giles Whittel is the deputy editor-in-chief of The Observer. He grew up mainly in Africa, studied history, and worked as a London Times correspondent in Los Angeles, in Moscow, and Washington. He was the chief leader writer for the London Times before he joined Tortoise Media, which is now The Observer, back in 2018. Along the way, he's written a few books, including Spitfire Women of World War II, Bridges of Spies, and my absolute favorite, A Biography of Snow. Hey, Giles, great to see you. And maybe one day we will actually get to talk about snow from an international perspective.
I look forward to it. Great to be here.
Michael Shear is chief UK correspondent of the New York Times. Prior to moving to London, he covered the White House under the presidencies of Obama, Trump, and Biden, and he reported on local politics for the Washington Post for many years. By the way, if you can't reach him, go into a casino, because that you will find him on the poker table. Just learned he's going for the 3rd time to the World Series of Poker, the World Poker Champion, the World something or other. Well, it's great to have you to join us here for the first time. It's been a while since we've seen each other.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is really fun. I appreciate it.
Hey, Giles, let's start with you and Ukraine. 4 years of really intensive war, longer now than the Soviet Union fought in World War II. Although, as the Ukrainians point out, they were fighting in that war as well. It's not been going well for Moscow since the very beginning. So, where do you think things stand, and where do you see things going?
Things stand at a stalemate. I'd like to start by zooming right into the city of Kherson, on the Dnipro River, where we sent a correspondent for part of our 4 years in coverage. She spent 3 days and nights there under more or less constant fire from drones and artillery. But one line in her piece really stuck out for me. She visited a community center which had started doing therapy sessions and dance classes for kids. And last December, just before Christmas, a 3-year-old came to it for the first time. It was that toddler's first time outdoors in his life. So that is just a sense of what it has been like while the rest of the world has covered it intensively in the first few months. And then you know the way it is. We move on. Our attention gets grabbed by other conflicts, other stories. It has been like that constantly in that particular city on the front line. Zoom out a little bit, and one of the things that really strikes me about that front line is the cliche about it being trenches and like World War I don't think is true. I've not been there, but it's now 30 kilometers wide. It's a wide kill zone, patrolled constantly by drones. And as I understand it from reading, dispatches from the front, very little movement, especially in daylight, because if you move, you will get targeted by drones. Zooming out again, you mentioned the losses. They are quite staggering. 30,000 Russian dead per month, possibly. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, recently claimed 35,000 dead, while Russia is able to mobilize barely that, like 40,000 new soldiers per month. But I think another data point worth looking at is the per head number of fighting age men dead or wounded so far in this war on the Russian side, 1 in 25. In Ukraine, being a smaller country, 1 in 16. Mobilizing more men for the front on both sides. Now, a real challenge to them. The Ukrainian side, obviously, it has the motivation of defending their homeland. And then just zooming out one more time to the bigger picture. Europe, crucial, but not organized, unable yet to see an easy way around the blockages put up by recalcitrant members like Hungary, unable so far to mobilize frozen Russian sovereign assets in Ukraine's defense. The US, not actively opposed to Ukraine at the moment, but not actively engaged on Ukraine's behalf. The peace talks stalled. Strategically, Ukraine has a military plan to raise the Russian body count as far as it can, but no bigger strategic plan that we can see except to hold the line. So Russia, where is Russia in all this? Concerningly, it comes the closest, I think, to any party to this conflict to having a plan, and that is to keep fighting as long as it can claim to be making ground, though, of course, that's extremely costly and very slow, but more particularly to try to achieve Putin's most cherished goal, which is to split NATO, or at least weaken NATO's resolve. And there is a risk that will happen. I'll stop, but just close on one point, coming back to Europe and the overwhelming responsibility on Europe, given the diminished US role in all this. And I'm borrowing here from Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. He itemizes 3 goals: counter Russian subversion, prevent Russia from splitting European resolve or weakening it, arm Ukraine in the absence of a greater role in that department on the American side, and make make sanctions count. And when you say that in relation to Europe, what that really means is stop burning Russian oil and gas.
Yeah, and interfere with the ability of the Russians to sell it to other places in on these ghost ships. Giles, that was a really well done, from the stoicism of the people all the way up to the larger piece. And I think you've encapsulated both the despair in some ways of a war that is continuing with no end in sight, and yet also the likelihood that that as long as Ukraine gets the support it needs, it will stand on its feet. Felicia, what I'm sort of interested in is the debate in Washington seems to have been so far removed from what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, in the sense that we spend all of our time talking about the latest discussion that may be taking place in Geneva or in Miami or in Abu Dhabi between some, if not all, or both of the warring parties, as if this is actually real, as if this actually matters, as opposed to the reality that the President of the United States, on the 4th anniversary of the war, speaking to the nation from the State of the Union, didn't mention the fact Ukraine, other than to say it wouldn't have happened if he had been president. One of the most inane statements that he keeps on harping and using Vladimir Putin, of all people, as proof. And yet not remarking on the reality that he promised to end this war in one day. And we're on, in year 5 now, and the war continues. How is Washington dealing with this issue, given where we started, which was full out 100% support for Ukraine? We spend hundreds of billions, $100 billion, not hundreds of billions, but to support Ukraine, and somehow it's all gone. It's no longer part of the discussion.
As a foreign policy reporter, I'm loath to mention politics, but I think the 2026 of it all is really important here. Depending on who you talk to, they can cite different polls about, there are some polls showing that Republicans are in favor of supporting Ukraine and so on. But generally speaking, the American public doesn't like foreign intervention. Trump's approval ratings are very low. And those don't really have much to do with foreign policy. It has more to do with the economy and other things. But I think that he doesn't really, he wants to be the one to solve the wars. He wants his Nobel Peace Prize. But on a day-to-day basis, I think that there is just, as you mentioned, not a ton of interest here. I think in Congress, we have this debate over this long-fought sanctions legislation from Lindsey Graham, but now there's kind of some hiccups there. There's some other legislation that would target the shadow fleet that you touched on earlier. So I think that, I think one of the things I always hear from European officials in contacts, in the Ukrainian context, is that, the war feels very far away to Americans, even more so now, I think. Unfortunately, there is some Ukraine fatigue here. And I think that Trump's not feeling a ton of pressure to do more than he's doing, which is not very much. And I think they do take the negotiation process very seriously. And if you talk to Trump administration officials, they'll tell you how well it's going, that it's really picked up since the Geneva process kind of kicked off in the fall of last year, after this 28-point plan that freaked everyone out. That was, we don't need to totally go into, but was, widely viewed as a Russian authored document that made the Ukrainians and Europeans very upset. So I think that we are in this kind of weird parallel zone where Russia keeps stepping up its attacks. It's been, one of the worst winters in Ukraine. Before every round, Russia, goes in and does some of its most dangerous or most significant nights of attacks on energy infrastructure and whatever. So, but the Trump team kind of still wants to solve this diplomatically and hasn't been willing to kind of do much more than what they're doing.
That's exactly right. And Michael, Giles, I think, rightly pointed out that the Europeans are kind of key to this. And yet, if they are key, they're kind of failing just as much as in some ways as the Americans, in the sense that They're not even at the negotiating table. Somehow they have been able to have seeded that and allowed it to be ceded to the United States, who is acting as if this is a war. I think it's Steve Witkoff who said it's a silly war. Tell that to the people who are dying and fighting on the front line. The United States, again, and this time didn't side with Russia, but at least abstained in the UN on the war. And the Europeans somehow still seems to be deferential. They're buying American weapons in order to help them. They're not really doing what you would expect them to do if they thought that this was so fundamental to their national security. So how do you, when you talk to folks there, what are they telling you?
So the interesting thing, if you compare it to what Felicia was saying about the Americans, if the Americans don't have the will anymore to really prosecute an effective defense of Ukraine or war back against Russia, they certainly have the means, but they don't have the will in the United States. In Europe, it's kind of the reverse. I think there is. Giles makes a good point about the fact that they've sort of stumbled around on the frozen assets thing, and that's true. And you could sort of argue that is a lack of willpower and sort of ability to get everybody to agree. But I think the bigger problem for them is that they do have, generally speaking, with some exceptions, a kind of unity of thought and commitment to Ukraine and a desire to do the right thing and to come to the defense of Ukraine against Russia. But at the end of the day, they don't have the ability. They don't have the defense industrial complex like the United States does. They don't have enough factories. They don't have the they don't have the weaponry that they would need to supplant the United States in this effort. And so they're sort of, and then as you say, they sort of, gave away whatever kind of moral authority and authority to be sitting around the table to the United States, not because they had made some kind of judgment about Ukraine, but rather because they'd made judgments about all sorts of other things that they rely on the United States for economically and trade. And we can get into some of that with tariffs later on. But they all collectively said, shoot, we can't anger the Americans because the Americans have all this leverage over us in other areas. And so they sort of accepted the fact that they were going to play second fiddle to Witkoff and the others in the discussions. And so you sort of combine all that. And the answer is that the Europeans, talk a lot, they meet a lot, the coalition of the willing, all these countries, they come together and Politico, Felicia's organization, calls it the COW meetings, COW, Coalition of the Willing. I'm not sure that's the acronym they wanted to use, but it doesn't do much. In the end, it's just a lot of talk.
Giles, I'll just come back to you. If 2026 is really the year of Europe, it's the year that Europe needs to stand up because it has realized it can no longer depend on the United States. Or the Greenland hit that with a 2x4 in their head. And Felicia and I were in Munich, and that was the theme. The theme was, we're no longer relying on the United States. We got to figure out how to do ourselves. But on this one, they can't even get the 90 million that they agreed back in December because Viktor Orban, by the way, immediately after Marco Rubio met with him, Viktor Orban decided that he was going to veto an agreement that he had already signed up to 2 months ago. And you do have to wonder, if you're sitting in Ukraine and you're watching this, and ultimately your ability to resist depends on the support that you need from others. Are we in a turning point that Europe is going to do what it needs to do, starting, frankly, with Ukraine?
Well, if the experience of the last 4 years is any guide, no. But it's tantalizing, and I risk sounding like an armchair general here. But Ukraine alone, let me rephrase that. Ukraine, with significant assistance from the US, held the line for a very long time. Ukraine, with increasing amounts of European help, in particular German now, is rebuilding its own military-industrial capacity, so that there are certain weapon systems like their own Flamingo cruise missiles, which we're told could really make a significant difference. The fact that they are holding the line right now suggests to me and others that it wouldn't take a tremendous amount more support, more organization on Europe's part to actually turn the tide militarily on the front. And we know from reports from inside Russia that it's getting, as we say in technical language, squeaky bum time for Putin. Inflation is up. This overheated economy, which has proved much more durable than people thought, is really hurting for average Russians. Who knows? Maybe even the oligarchs are getting tired of not being able to travel or invest anywhere. To your question, what happens in 2026? There isn't much reason to be optimistic, but there is reason for Europe to think a little more coherently, bravely, and strategically.
Yeah, I actually think that that you probably hit the nail on the head in terms of both the problem inside Russia that is becoming increasingly evident. I just read a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, I don't remember where I read it because it's hard to figure out where you read these things, about the problems of utilities in Murmansk. And the mayor of Murmansk, and there's no hot water, there's no heating and anything else. And the mayor of Murmansk said, well, the reason was there's frost and wind. Well, that's new in Murmansk in winter, obviously, and it's making people quite worried. Let's hope, Giles, that the Europeans on the one hand get their act together, and on the other hand that the Russians continue to suffer as a result, and that we see that outcome. We're talking to Giles Whittel of The Observer, Felicia Schwartz of Politico, and Michael Shear of The New York Times. Michael, let's turn to you next. The Supreme Court decision saying that the use of IEPA, this Emergency Power Act that the United States, the Trump administration has relied on to impose these reciprocal tariffs and to use, frankly, tariffs for anything, that act does not allow him to do that. And he needs to go and look at real authorities that are granted by Congress to him. Under the Constitution, Congress regulates commerce. It's a big deal, certainly at home. How is it being seen in the rest of the world? Is there now this sense that we're going to get back to some kind of regular order, or is there a worry that no, this cat's out of the bag? America's protection is not just now, but forever. How do you see it, and what does your reporting show?
Right. So let me get to that question, because I think that is one of the central questions. But to take a step back, I've covered Trump for more than a decade now, since he came down the escalator in 2015. And I think if there's an enduring kind of way to sort of, or to think about his thoughts as a kind of in an organized fashion, that's difficult because you just listen to a speech of his and it doesn't seem very organized. But there is a basic organizational principle to the way he thinks, and that's basically the connection between money and power, and the use of money as leverage for power. That's how he operated as a real estate mogul. That's how he operated as a TV show host. And frankly, it's the way he has operated as president. Most of what he does is an attempt to leverage power for himself. And nothing is more fundamental to that effort than his tariffs. And as you said at the beginning, the tariffs are on the surface a financial instrument designed to change the dynamics of trade between one country and another country, but he doesn't really see them that way. He sees them as a tool to influence and leverage other countries for every purpose under the sun, whether it's, leveraging China not to ship fentanyl, or forcing the Mexican government to put troops along the border to stop migrants from coming up, or to buy Greenland, or the list goes on and on and on. And I think with that as the backdrop, what makes the Supreme Court's decision so important is that it in one fell swoop stripped him of this incredibly powerful tool to try to assert American dominance, but more important, Trumpian dominance over the rest of the world. And so to that extent, I think the world is kind of breathing a sigh of relief. Okay, one of these tools, one of the clubs that the president would hold over us every time we wanted to talk about anything, he would say, well, if you do that, I'll tariff the heck out of you, or I will, change the way that our countries, I'll essentially come after your economy and your people. So I think they're breathing a sigh of relief. The problem is that Trump has not done what so many presidents have been forced to do in the face of these Supreme Court decisions that have gone against them and say, well, I disagree, but I will hereby stand down. Essentially, I mean, he's vowed to essentially find workarounds. So I think the sigh of relief is tempered in European capitals by the notion that he's going to keep coming after them. He's already imposed a 10% tariff based on another law that might not be able to be permanent, though. Like, whether or not he will accept that limitation is unclear. What process other countries have to really complain if he continues to impose tariffs in a way that they think is not legal. It's sort of unclear how much the influence they can actually, sort of what is the actual process that they can use to stop that. So I think there's still a kind of collective, everybody holding their breath to see what comes next. And again, that's not just in the economic sphere, but in everything, because they realize they are at his mercy at some level.
I mean, I think, Michael, that you laid it out really well, and I think that is in some ways, Felicia, the Trump administration sees, okay, so one avenue is closed, we'll just use another avenue, but that other avenue actually isn't as clear, and as Michael said rightly, the 10 or soon to be 15% across the board tariffs are time limited unless Congress votes for that. Let's see if Congress is going to vote for tariffs days before the midterm election. And some of the other ones just take a lot of investigation, and they're sector specific and they're not country specific, which makes it so hard to use them as a great power tool that the way he has used it. But when you talk to folks in Washington, particularly in the administration, but also on the other side, do they understand how big a deal this Supreme Court decision was, in fact, in taking away that cudgel? Or do they basically say, you know what, it's one thing, we'll just go on and do something else?
I think the administration's view is definitely that tariffs are here to stay, that this is a signature, I think, as Michael said well, that his commitment to tariffs is extremely long held. They spent a lot of time when Trump was out of office thinking about how to do it. They do have other strategies. I think they saw IEPA as kind of the easiest path, but not the only one. And so I think on the one hand, or I should say, at least from the administration's perspective, they are going to see what they can do. I don't think they think the battle is over. I think they place a lot of faith in the kind of executive power of the president. And I think Michael's 100% correct that this is the U.S. economic might is Trump's kind of favorite tool. And I think just in the, year or so that Trump's been back in power, I think it's completely changed Europe's behavior in some respects. When the U.S. has wielded this as a cudgel, it's something that other American presidents, at least, this is my, I think, fourth administration as a reporter in Washington, they've not really been willing to do in the same way. And I think it's had kind of a significant effect. So I don't think that the administration is giving up. I still think that they think this is a big tool for them. I think for others, it depends. I think that there's some countries like Japan, for example, that, maybe has gotten short shrift. The European Parliament has been delaying votes, so I'm sure Giles will talk about that. And so, I do think there is this gray area. I think there is some hope, but also I think people understand that Trump does what he says, that he's very committed to this tool, that it's not going to go away. And maybe there are some kind of creative workarounds or at least a temporary reprieve, but I don't think anyone truly thinks that this is kind of the end of the road or that this is the end of the story here for tariffs.
So, Giles, the UK, of course, was the first one out of the starting dock to get an agreement with the United States. I think it's still not finalized, if I'm right. And the European Union went, and the Japanese went, and the South Koreans went, and the Australians had an agreement already before, et cetera. And all of a sudden, the tool that he used, tariffs, the threat of tariffs, to get those deals is lesser than it was before. The Chinese have basically said, okay, that's great. So now we'll just go do whatever we want to do. We'll accept the 10%. I think they're down to 23% total tariffs, which for them is a doable proposition. Do you think the Brits and the EU and the Japanese are now going to say, well, you know what? Here's the lesson. We were able to stop tariffs on Greenland. Maybe we can stop tariffs, period, if we just stand up and say no.
I don't think everyone's going to do the same thing. The big point is that the ruling, which, by the way, when it came down, I nudged a colleague who happens to be from your great country, and I said, yay, checks and balances, Civics 101, it's working, The delirium subsided quite quickly as he got behind the microphone and did his pouty act. But the ruling is a kind of a point in time which gives every jurisdiction an opportunity, responsibility to decide, are we going to take a stand where we perhaps haven't before, or are we going to continue our broader policy of kissing up to this administration? In the UK, they've, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, so far have decided to do the latter, as you would have expected.
Absolutely.
A lot of kissing up from the Brits.
It's what we're good at, I'm afraid. But yeah, I looked this up because I realized I wasn't clear in my own mind. The UK position right now, and it's complicated for everybody, is they are asserting that the originally negotiated 10% across the board tariff stands. Separate sector deals also negotiated stand. The 15% threatened will not apply. But if it turns out that it does, the UK, having been the first and having been quite smug about the deal that it negotiated, will be amongst the worst off. And so that will accentuate the question, do we continue to kiss up, or do we try to take a stand? And to the broader question, the EU, which is much more of a 600-pound gorilla in these affairs, is, I think, weighing up whether to get tough. I just close on, attaboy Supreme Court. I thought it was a fascinating civics lesson.
It was a fascinating civics lesson, and for those who are lawyers, of which I am not, the disagreement among the six who agreed was in and of itself a lawyerly way to do business. Michael, just on, do you see any evidence of other countries saying, you know what? Actually, we can push back. Is there any evidence also on the side of the business side? I mean, you mentioned, maybe he will just impose this tariff for longer than 150 days. But if it's illegal, businesses may decide they won't pay. And so it's really messy.
There's some evidence of some pushback. I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of lawsuits already filed by companies all over the world that are, want to get some of this money back that they now realize they paid, for use of a law that was not legal. I do think, as Giles said, that it's possible the EU could become somewhat more aggressive. They have a little bit more firepower because they're so much larger. To sort of draw a little connection between our previous conversation and this one, everything is interconnected. And so, you have the people here, the people that I talk to in the Foreign Office in the UK who say, look, standing up to Trump on tariffs, for example, is difficult to do when you're also going hat in hand to the United States to purchase a bunch of weapons and to sort of ask them to be the sort of backstop shield for the Ukraine situation. And then you've got the Middle East, and you've got so there's you've got this whole debate in Europe about civilizational erasure, which is what the U.S. is pressing them on. And so you've got all of these pressure points, and it's not as easy, I think, for some of them to say, as much as people would like them to, go, jump in a lake, Mr. Trump, on tariffs, because they Europe is and has been so connected to the U.S. for so long.
That's Michael Shear of the New York Times. I'm also joined by Felicia Schwartz of Politico and Giles Whittel of The Observer. Let's shift, Felicia, to the last of our three topics. Really a fascinating topic, Cuba. It's the same old, same old. The United States wants to have regime change in Cuba, and it hasn't succeeded. We have sanctions and had them for a long time, embargoes, and now the United States has imposed an oil embargo on Cuba for all practical purposes. And you're now seeing all of a sudden people saying, well, maybe we don't really need regime change. Maybe we just need, another person who can run the government who we like better and will do our bidding. So, Felicia, you're looking at this. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, former archivist, Viceroy of Venezuela, all those titles. This is his baby. He's been saying some really interesting things in the last few days. What is the administration trying to do? What's the strategy, and how much traction is it getting?
Well, one thing I want to say is that it's always interesting when, Marco Rubio is kind of a fascinating character because I think, maybe he was seen in Congress as like a Russia hawk, and maybe that was a bit exaggerated. I think that he has kind of donned different ideological perspectives as they're convenient to him, but his hope for regime change in Cuba is a very long-held, deeply seated belief that has gone with him even as he's gone through many kind of shape shifts, or as someone put it to me, software updates. And so it's always kind of interesting to kind of see someone like Marco Rubio, who has such strongly held beliefs, be in power and kind of reckon with what it means to have the reins to kind of be able to actually try to enact some of these things that he's really sought for a long time. And so I think one, the Venezuela example looms very large here. We're talking about Cuba, but I think what the administration has been able to achieve there colors a lot of factors. I mean, maybe next week you'll be talking about Iran, and I think the Venezuela example, that they were kind of able to find a convenient person who wasn't the boogeyman and guide them with a lot of U.S. influence with kind of relatively little cost. I think they're thinking, how can we do that in Cuba? And also that, of course, the situation in Cuba is so bad right now that maybe they don't need to do much. They have a lot of leverage, of course, with this oil embargo that they've imposed. Now that they're quote unquote in control of Venezuela, they've had a lot of ability to tell the Venezuelans not to sell oil to Cuba. We'll talk in a minute about how they've backtracked a little bit on that. But so now they have a lot of power over what happens on the islands. But, of course, lots of, two significant ones, like have two presidents have dealt with what happens when you have mass migration flows of Cubans to the U.S. It's a political crisis. They don't want that. Immigration is one of Trump's signature issues, of course. An American manufactured government crisis in Cuba does not meet America's needs. And I think that Marco Rubio understands that. So they've kind of sought this, middle ground, regime change light, realpolitik regime change. This is kind of a new frame of if Bush Republicanism was this very expansionist, freedom-fighting kind of democracy rules sort of perspective. This one is way more like, can we make little tweaks on the margins, and can we kind of think about American markets and how American companies might benefit, and will that over time bring things along? So the policy basically is, on the one hand, to exert a ton of economic pressure on Cuba so that its leaders, or at least Rubio has met with one of Raul, I think it's his grandson or his nephew or whatever, one of the kind of extended family members, to who's seen as more moderate and might be someone that the U.S. can work with. And the idea there being like, Raul Castro isn't going to work for us, but we don't need to change the whole system. We just need to find someone from another generation. And I was going to say it's the grandson of Raul Castro. To correct myself, but we can find someone in this next generation who has lived through a lot of hardship on the island and can be someone who kind of bring things forward. And if they'll work with us, and can we convince them to kind of at least change the socialist economy? I think that's what they're trying to do via this oil embargo, via these other conversations. I think they don't want things getting too bad in Cuba, which is why you've seen that they've backtracked a little bit and they're allowing some shipment of Venezuelan oil, provided it goes to the private sector and not the government, because again, they don't need a huge migration crisis. So they're kind of trying to they're walking a very fine line. Cuba has been bad for a long time. I mean, I went with John Kerry to open the embassy in 2014. I went back with the Chamber of Commerce delegation 6 months later, and there was all this excitement about, because the Obama administration approach was kind of the same, that they didn't need to, but on the way far end of the spectrum, that they didn't need to replace the Castros. They just needed to incentivize people to kind of embrace free markets and capitalism. They were kind of doing it, with carrots. Now the Trump administration is trying to do it with sticks. Like, your economy is running the island to the ground, and if you keep going, you're screwed, essentially. But there was a lot of optimism back then. Now things on the island are, as bad as they've ever been, and the island is like the closest it's ever been to collapse. So yeah, they're walking a really fine line.
I think that's a great way you put it. And you're right that Obama and Rubio, the policies were kind of the same. It's a gradual change, one through carrots, the other one through sticks. Giles, as a student of history, what this sounds to me, and I'm actually thinking about this in the larger context that Felicia put it in Venezuela, and to some extent what they want in Iran, this is how empires used to be run. You would take over a country, you would put in somebody who would do your bidding, and then and they would take care of it. Marco Rubio talked about this 500-year wonderful history in Munich that we in the West shared when we ran the world and expanded, brought freedom and Christianity. Actually, didn't use freedom, but Christianity to so many parts around the world. Is this what we're watching? We're seeing a return to old-fashioned 19th century imperialism?
To a point, as they say. I mean, the phrase prancing proconsuls comes to mind. That is from the age when imperial powers used to parachute their own guys in, mainly guys. There is a difference here, as Felicia's pointed out. They've found someone in situ in Venezuela. The signs are they're trying to do the same thing in Cuba. If there was an Iranian equivalent, God help us, we'd probably find them looking for people in the IRGC to work with. That is a grim scenario, but I think you're right. It's a variation on the imperialist theme. It's kind of, if you're looking for a historical analogy, it would be the late rather than mid or early British Empire tactics: arm's length, minimum cost, minimum investment and risk. One line from looking into this that really stuck with me: the ambassador there, the U.S. ambassador Mike Hammer, who used to be a stand-up NSC spokesperson when I was in Washington, said the project is ending. Implication being, whatever we do, our reading of it is Castroism is on a glide slope to oblivion. And he may be right.
The project is ending. By the way, Mike Hammer's a very good Foreign Service officer, been there for a very, very long time, and is now our whatever. He's not an ambassador because we don't have an ambassador because we don't have diplomatic relations. But but the line, I think, is exactly right. And Michael, to you as a student of American foreign policy for a long time, if there's one constant since 1959, since Castro came to power, it's been the conviction on the part of the United States that the project is ending. It has been ending for 67 years. Is it now really ending? And is Trump pushing it across the finish line?
Well, I mean, as anybody who knows that part of American history would know, that, even when the Americans try to push for the project to end, it doesn't always work out that way. And so it may not work out that way this time. Sometimes countries have a way of being more resilient than the imperial power likes to think. The only, I guess, other thought that I would add here is that, yes, there's a long history of policy here and the sort of American approach to Cuba. But I think you also need to factor in that so much of what Trump does isn't about policy, isn't about pursuing a kind of logical agenda. It's about self-aggrandizement. It's about the whims of whatever he, happens to be thinking when he gets constipated that day or whatever. I mean, it's a kind of, all you have to do is listen to him complain about windmills over and over again. And so some of why he liked Venezuela was just because it made him feel good that he flexed, the power of the presidency. And so, that is what in part injects so much uncertainty into what happens next. There's lots of people who look at what happened in Venezuela and think, gee, I wonder whether he could decide at some point that it makes just more sense to do something like that in Cuba. Very different country, very different situation and whatever. But because it's Trump and because so much of this is not it used to be in the White House, the National Security Council had these like endless processes of convening deputies committee meetings and then principal committee meetings and all the way up through the National Security Council. There's none of that anymore. It's just, whoever walks into the White House and into the Oval Office and talks to Trump. So, that's the only caution I would give is that we don't know what's going to happen because he's so unpredictable.
Well, and that may be one of his, in some ways, his strengths because the people on the other side don't know what's going to happen and they're trying to react to that. But it doesn't leave. It makes for difficult analysis. I think that's how I would put it, at the very least. We have to leave it here. What a great conversation! Thanks so much. I want to thank Felicia Schwartz of the Politico, Giles Whittel of the Observer, and Michael Shear of the New York Times. Terrific insights. Looking forward to having you back soon. And thank you all for listening. World Review is a Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs podcast from Harvard's Kennedy School. This week's episode was produced by Tectonic Videos. I am Ivo Daalder. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a grand week, everyone.